Okay, and we are recording.
Yeah. So today's seminar is by Mariel Jones. She's doing her PhD recent. I don't know about this. She is now a PhD candidate and in water resource sciences. And her advisor is Roy Fing and civil, environmental, geological engineering. And her research a lot has to do with peat. And so she was telling me before the seminar that she's getting along very well on her data and everything. And so today she's going to talk about one aspect of it, which has to do with the seasonally frozen ground. Very
awesome. Well, thank you, John. It's exciting to be here and present a little bit about my research. I realized recently that outside of like the WRC conference, I haven't really gotten the chance to present a lot of this research. So it's fun to kind of share that with some of the newer students and with the rest of you. So today I am going to be talking about, let's see if I can get the clicker to work here. Okay, yes. I am going to be talking about kind of 3 ongoing projects that all center around the same kind of idea of the ecological feedbacks between wetland ecosystems, snow, and soil frost. And while there are 3 different projects that all focus on this, they come from different, come at these questions from different scales and from different methodologies. So I'm going to talk about an case study project. Should I use the little, like, I don't actually know whether anyone online can see me with the stick. So maybe I'll use the little laser pointer here. But I'm going to talk first about a case study that we've completed looking at hydrologic connectivity and stream flow generation and its relationship to soil frost at the Mariel Experimental Forest. And this is done at a watershed scale using long-term statistical records from the MEF. And then I'm going to talk about 2 kind of ongoing projects that we're just getting started with. One, which is a field-based project, which is kind of more on the sub-catchment scale, which is doing a gridded field research that is aimed at expanding temporal and spatial resolution of snow and frost measurements in peatland watersheds. And then the last one I'm going to talk about is a modeling-based project, which then goes down further to the column-based scale. And we will be using land surface models to piece apart the physical processes that drive the relationship between soil frost and carbon emissions from peatlands. But before I dive super far into that, I want to talk a little bit more about peatlands and their kind of relative importance in hydrology. And so this is actually one of my advisor's favorite figures to use when she's talking about the importance of peatlands, and it's kind of easy to see why. It's pretty stark to think about the fact that peatlands, which make up less than 3% of our world's surface area, are responsible for somewhere between 30 and 50% of the world's total carbon stores, and twice as much as the world's forests combined. Peatlands, as I was just telling John, have gotten a lot of press recently, actually. So there's this article from 2019 from the UN. I've seen them featured a lot in Nat Geo recently. The New York Times actually did a series on peat and how it might be kind of the, as they called it, the like our savior in terms of climate change. I don't think that's true. But a lot of peatlands' abilities to buffer our increasing CO2 levels does come down to actually its hydrology. So I want to walk through a little bit of that and kind of peat's ability to store and release carbon is actually driven predominantly by its water table. So if we think about a peat layer like this, we can divide it into 2 major regions, a periodically saturated region or zone on top and a persistently saturated zone on the bottom. And as our water table fluctuates between these 2 regions, we end up with, when it's in the high water table and that periodic zone is inundated, we end up with methane production. in that upper layer. And then if it drops down to the point where the periodic zone is aerated, we end up with methane oxidation in the upper layer. And in actuality, it's a little bit more complicated than this. Methane emissions also have to do with the frequency at which we're switching back and forth between these two regions. But for now, this model will kind of suffice. And so a lot of my research comes out of a project that my advisor was working on right before I arrived, actually, which looked at the relationship between these water table dynamics and the sensitivity of methane emissions to temperature. So temperature is also one of the major driving forces of methane emissions in peatlands. But what they were able to see in this study was that there are two main ways that water table is affecting this sensitive relationship. One is that spring averaged water table, as you can see in this top plot, is very influential on the sensitivity of methane emissions to changes in temperature. So as we get higher water tables during the spring, so as we spend more and more time in this periodically inundated zone, we end up with methane emissions that are less and less sensitive to temperature changes. The other influence happens during the summer, and this is on the relationship between methane and temperature hysteresis. So this happens when over the course of the summer, methane emissions will start to increase because of the warming temperatures. And then the next year, it's that inability of methane emissions to return to those kind of base values. So we have consistently kind of increasing methane concentrations. And so from here, we can see that summer average water tables lead to higher and higher amounts of hysteresis as we increase our water table elevations. But the big kind of takeaway from this was that shifts in water availability from this winter to spring may cause increases in methane emissions independent of temperature. And so the big question that kind of comes out of this is then, what are we seeing in terms of water table elevation trends? And that's where my research starts. And so here we kind of take a step to look at what those trends in water table elevation are at the Mariel Experimental Forest, which is part of the USDA, US Forest Service Experimental Forest Network. So there are about 20 of these sites across the country that are all focused on advancing forestry and hydrology research through paired watershed experiments. But what makes Mariel particularly special, other than the fact that it's here in Minnesota, it's about 3 hours drive north of here near Grand Rapids, is that the watersheds are both some of the oldest. Well, the experimental forest is one of the oldest, so it was started in 1961 and started taking data in 1961. So there's this wealth of climate and hydrology and biogeochemistry data available from Mariel, just ready for researchers to use. And then the second one is that it's the only experimental forest where the watersheds are peatland dominated. And so this really provides the perfect environment for us to look at all of these records and see how over the last 60 years peatlands have been changing.
Hi, on Zoom, we're unable to see the slides.
Oh, interesting.
We just see the intro slide.
Huh. When I switch, it doesn't.
I think your share screen may be on the wrong selection.
This
Maybe.
one? That's so weird. Why are there two?
Or it might be the order in which you hit share versus present.
Huh. So you don't see this as I'm switching?
No, we see like the slide, not the presentation mode, the mode with the notes. And we still only see the title slide.
Huh. Okay. Let's try this then. I'm very sorry. We were seeing them up in the room, so I figured it was. Let's try sharing.
Sorry too for interrupting you. It's one of those, like, it's hard to get this message to you while you're like mid.
That's okay. Do you see?
Now it looks like share on the Zoom has presenter mode. Can you try going forward a slide?
Yeah, but now I can't find it on my screen. Whoops. Ah, now can you see it?
Woohoo!
Okay, awesome. So I'll just speed through what I just said, which is that I'm going to talk about the 3 different projects that you see here. And then this is our figure that my advisor likes so much from the UN. Here is our peak column and our oscillating water table elevation. And then our 2 plots that I was just talking about in terms of methane and temperature sensitivity. So here's Marcel that I was just doing a little introduction to. So Marcel, as you can see here, has 6 bog watersheds. So there are these 4 down here in the south unit. Can I scroll over? Yes. Okay. These 4 down here in the south unit and then 2 up here in the north unit. And then it also has 2 fen watersheds as well. And so the majority of my research focuses on the S2 and the S5 bog watersheds. These are the 2 control catchments at Marcel. So there have not had any significant kind of deforestation or afforestation during the last 60 years. And then recently we've also delved a little bit into the S2 bog as well, because its coniferous forests offer a nice juxtaposition to the S2 and the S5 bogs. And so as we were starting with this, we looked first kind of at this water table elevation trend in the S2 bog. And as you can see, over the last 25 years, it's pretty apparent that there's been a big decrease in average annual water table elevation. And that's marked by kind of two big characteristics. One is this massive drawdown that's happening over the course of the winter. That's increasing a little bit kind of as the years go on. And then there's this big recharge event during the spring as the snow melts. But that recharge isn't quite enough to kind of restore to the original, like the average water table elevation from the previous year. So we end up getting this slight decline over the course of the year. And so thinking about what we know now about water availability in the summer and its influence on carbon emissions, we wanted to explore a little bit about why this might be happening. So what factors in relating to winter hydrology mostly, and that winter-spring transition because of that big recharge event might be causing this decline in water table elevation. So to do this, because we are scientists, we decided, and we have all this data available from Marcel, we pulled even more data into this. And so here what we can see is a couple different of the different data streams that we have from Marcel. So in this plot in the green, we have snow depth over the course of the winter season. So this is the water year. And then we have in blue here, the stream flow. This line going across is our water table elevation. And then on the top here, we have precipitation inputs. And so what we were really curious about here was the flow and the connectedness of kind of what path the water was taking from this snowpack to get to the water table elevation, and eventually what might be causing this decline. And so what we did was we took all of this data and we used a signal processing technique to pull out key dates or key hydrological events that are important to this spring season. So things like this might be like our peak snowfall here, which signals the end of the snow accumulation season and the beginning of the snow melt season, or our water table trough, which signals the beginning of that spring recharge event. And what we did was we pulled out each of these dates for our kind of 25 years of data. And so those were 25 years where we had all of these data available. And we averaged them out. So here on the bottom, you can see in the light blue are those events for each of our individual years. And then in the dark blue are the average values. So what we end up seeing is this very clear cascade of water flowing from the snowpack down through the soil, infiltrating to the water table. And then that water table begins to rise. And once it gets beyond the surface elevation, we see a stream flow initiation. And then it also operates kind of backwards as well. So then once our snow has completely disappeared, our water table peaks shortly after that. And then almost immediately after we see our water table peak, we have our first stream flow peak of the year. And so what this really goes to show is that clear connection, that clear continuity between the snowpack and the wetland water table elevation, and then the stream flow as well. And so if we actually go back and look at our water table elevation from stream flow, we can see that there is this very clear threshold in water table that dictates our stream flow from the watershed. So there's that threshold there signified by the gray line is actually almost exactly the wetland water table, or the wetland elevation. So as it rises kind of beyond that surface level, we start producing stream flow. And so what this really shows for us is there's this clear connection between water table and stream flow, and generally between snowpack water table and water availability in the spring and summer. But we're still kind of curious then, like, knowing this, is there one of these values, or is there one watershed characteristic that is the most important in dictating our spring and summer water availability? So we take this a little bit further, and don't let this slide scare you, is what we end up doing is running a statistical analysis. So we ended up building this multiple regression model that you see right at the bottom that includes all of the variables that we think might end up influencing stream flow from the watershed. So these are things that you generally might expect, like our peak snowpack, frost thickness, water table elevation, watershed characteristics, temperature, and precipitation. And what we do with this is we run what's called a stepwise multiple regression model. So what this does is it takes this base, or this master model, and it subsets all of this. So it runs every single smaller version of this model using the different combinations of variables that we fed into it. And what we're interested in here is not actually like which model is the best, because to be honest, none of them are great. What we're interested in seeing is what kind of variables show up in the best performing models of this analysis. So what you see here is the 5 top models that were best performing out of this analysis. And the first thing, what we run here is essentially like a variable importance analysis. So we're curious, of these top performing models, what variables stick out and what variables are most likely to be in what would be considered like a true model for stream flow from this watershed. And so what we do is we take a variable for each of these and we kind of sum across the likelihood of that model being real, the real and true model. And what this gives us is a probability that that variable would be in the true model for stream flow. So when we do this, we get a whole bunch of weights that are between 0 and 1 for all of the variables that we've fed into this model. And there are a couple here that are we would kind of expect to see, like, we do know that precipitation is pretty important in determining stream flow. We know that watershed characteristics are important in determining stream flow. Interestingly enough, the peak snowpack depth is a little further down here, but that's probably because the snow is being described up here by precipitation. But the biggest thing that you're probably wondering, and we certainly were when we got these results, is the fact that maximum frost thickness is actually all the way here at the top. And its weight is nearly 1. It's about 0.998, which means that the statistical model is almost certain that maximum frost thickness should be in the true model for stream flow generation for these watersheds. And sure enough, if we go back and we look at the relationship between maximum frost thickness and water table elevation, we do see that there is a statistically significant relationship where as we increase in frost thickness, we see lower and lower water table elevations. So there is clearly some factor of frost thickness here that is likely lowering our water table elevation. However, even if there is a statistical relationship, that doesn't necessarily explain why we're seeing such a strong influence of soil frost in the watershed, and it doesn't explain why or how frost is creating such a big influence. And so these are really the questions that feed into the rest of the research. But I want to go back for a bit and talk about soil frost in the context of hydrology for a second. So handily. There was actually a review paper published last year about soil frost and its influence on what the authors of this paper deemed hydrologic repercussions. So this was anything from frost's effect on stream flow, infiltration, ET, biogeochemistry. They all kind of lumped it into this term, hydrologic repercussions. And they looked at 300 studies that have looked at these hydrologic repercussions of soil frost. And they categorized them into either showing evident, occasional, uncertain, or absent effects of soil frost. And what they were really looking for here was whether there were trends in location, whether soil frost was more likely to have an influence in certain areas of the world, in certain types of watersheds, in certain types of climates. And ultimately what they found was that there was very little correlation anywhere. And that the effects of soil frost are very dependent on your individual watershed. There were two things that they pulled out as two patterns that they kind of pulled out. One was that soil frost was more likely to have an influence in smaller watersheds and less likely to have an influence in forested watersheds. So for Marcel, as a small forested watershed, this didn't really tell us whether or not the results we were finding made sense. The other thing that was kind of unique about this is that of the 300 studies that they looked at, very few of them happened in peatlands, which is mostly a little bit strange because there is such a significant overlap between the region where seasonally frozen ground or soil frost occurs and where the northern band of peatlands occur. So you can see that red line where the seasonally frozen ground, that southern border of the seasonally frozen ground is. That mass of dots right there on the end is also where a lot of peatlands tend to occur. So we would expect that in an ecosystem like peatlands, where the hydrology is so dependent, or where their ability to exchange carbon with the atmosphere is so dependent on their hydrology, and we've been seeing such big changes in winter inputs due to climate change, we would expect that hopefully we'd know a little bit more about that relationship. And so that's really where my research is trying to fill in some gaps. So the big question that drives our subsequent projects here are how and under what conditions does soil frost create landscape and hydrologic feedbacks within the wetland systems? And we're really tackling three big tasks to hopefully answer this question. The one big goal is to provide extra or just data in general for snow and frost in peatland systems. So really filling in that gap of just looking at what's happening and hopefully more fully understanding how these systems are responding to changes in snow inputs. The next thing that we're kind of curious about is seeing how external environmental factors are affecting both the accumulation of snow and the formation of soil frost. So as the forests in Marcel are growing, should we be seeing more snow accumulation, less snow accumulation? Are there variations across the Marcel watersheds as to the development of these two factors? So that's what our field study is oriented towards. And then the last thing that we'd like to know is more about the physical processes behind this influence that soil frost has on spring water availability and the division of that snow melt into kind of runoff and infiltration, and how that influence is changing due to climate change. And this is where our modeling study comes into play. So you might be wondering why both field and modeling studies. It seems like a lot. But they offer us different things that both will get us towards the same goal. And so with the modeling study, models can offer us a lot more control. So we can't necessarily go out to the field and say, I'd really like you to snow 40 centimeters over the course of this winter, because I want to know what that will cause in terms of stream flow. But we can go to our model and force it to snow 40 centimeters over the course of the winter. So it offers us more control. It also offers us the ability to parse through more variables. So we will be running this analysis in a land surface model that has thousands of equations that it solves. So if we're seeing some results in stream flow that we're not really sure why we're seeing that, we can go back and we can look at all of the individual kind of intermediate variables that we can't actually measure in situ. Conversely, the field measurements really allow us to capture all of the internal watershed heterogeneities that our model cannot. So like I said, we're running a land surface model where actually the grid scale is 25 by 25 kilometers, which encompasses the entirety of the Marcel experimental forest and then some. So at that scale where we're in the model looking at average values across a grid, we can't necessarily see the differences between watersheds, much less within a watershed as to how snow might accumulate. So that's something we can really only do with our field measurements. And so using both of these appropriately will be how we will actually be able to try and attempt to discern kind of our true frost and system behavior here. So diving into a little bit more, so this is where we get to the research that's still very ongoing. So I don't have a heck of a lot of results to present here, but you'll just learn a little bit more about the projects as we are going to be working on them. So this will be about our field study, which is, like I said, aimed at expanding the spatial and temporal resolution of our snow and frost measurements at Marcel. So you can see this is my advisor up here and one of my committee members, Sally Diamond, who is now at Northern Arizona University, traipsing through the forest. And so what we are doing here is really trying to correlate distinct watershed and climate and topographic controls on the accumulation of snow and the formation of soil frost. So just a little background on this. Generally, we know that there's a pretty coupled relationship between snow and soil frost. So as we have increasing snow depths, it provides, that snow layer provides a layer of thermal insulation so that we tend to see less and less soil frost underneath those large snow layers. And vice versa. So when we have less snow, we tend to see higher frost depths. However, things like our canopy layer will affect that relationship. So you can see here that under the trees, these trees provide some kind of snow interception. So we end up getting less snow underneath, but then they also provide an additional kind of thermal insulation so that we also tend to see less frost underneath. So that's one control that we do kind of know about in watersheds, but we're curious to see whether this also occurs in Marcel. We're also interested to see whether things like microtopography, which is a surface characteristic of peatlands, affects this accumulation and the soil frost generation, and also whether different parts of the wetland watershed will affect these relationships as well. So to do this, we are going in and we are using an existing vegetation sampling grid or a biomass sampling grid that was installed at Marcel in the 1960s and then re-upped in 1990s to take snow depth and SWE measurements, so snow water equivalent measurements. And this will really help us kind of quantify that snowpack across the watershed and capture some of those variations. And so what we are doing is we are taking each of these points and we went out and we hunted them all down. And as you can imagine, hunting down vegetation stakes that were placed in the 1960s was not very easy, but we managed to find most of them. And the people who laid them in the 60s did a pretty good job, actually. And you can imagine if they're out there with a compass, this is pretty darn square. So the light blue ones on here are ones that we did find. The dark blue ones are ones that we gave up trying to find and just placed new ones. And then the green ones are ones that we found very far off of where they should have been. But overall, they did a pretty good job. And so this winter at each of these locations, Anne, who's one of the research techs at Marcel, will be taking snow depth data for us. So we will be able to see how that snow is accumulating across the watershed. The other thing that we did was we went out and we took LAI photos, so leaf area index photos, and these allow us to give kind of a numerical value to canopy cover across the watershed. So you can see here two of those sample images. The one on the left here is in the uplands, so this kind of area around the bog, and you can see it's a little pretty dense, whereas this one here is right down in the bog and it's a lot more open. And so we would expect that here in the bog where the canopy is much more open, we'll probably see more accumulation. And so this will be able to give us an estimate of where we should see larger snow piles, snow drifts and snow piles versus where we shouldn't. So yeah, so generally just a couple of hypotheses here. I'll walk through them quickly. We do expect that as we see kind of denser forest canopies, we'll see lower snow accumulation, also lower melt rates because of that thermal insulation and the shade that kind of blocks the direct solar radiation in the spring, and then also lower frost depths. For frost, because you'll notice I didn't mention frost at any of those, frost is a little bit more difficult to measure. So right now what they do at Marcel is they go out with a drill and a shank and they drill straight into the ground until the resistance changes, and then they pull it out and they mark it, and that's how deep the frost depth is. But you can imagine if we want slightly more often measurements, we can't necessarily hike out to all of those locations and measure once a day or once a week. So instead, we're going to be putting in multi-depth soil moisture and temperature probes along two transects within each watershed. So these are the profiles that you can see, and it's a little bit misleading. The topography is not that steep within the watersheds. It's just relative. But we'll have 6 locations in each site that will capture kind of the difference in topography across the watersheds. And these multi-depth probes will allow us to then compute or model soil frost on an hourly basis. And what this will really be able to do with this, we will be able to get measurements across the entire frost season. So they went in the ground 2 weeks ago, so hopefully they should be starting to capture that frost formation right about now, and then they'll stay there throughout the winter, and then we'll be able to capture the frost melting out in the spring as well. And so really what we hope that this will do is be able to look at how antecedent fall soil moisture conditions also affect that formation of frost throughout the winter, and then how that frost in the winter affects spring soil moisture conditions as well. So we'll be seeing water available from snowmelt percolating into the soil layer, but also from that frost layer melting out as well. And so generally what we'll expect to see is that higher soil moistures in the fall will lead to larger, thicker soil frost depths in the winter. And then furthermore, those frost depths will lead to higher spring soil moisture conditions. And maybe, this is a big maybe, that will extend to summer soil moisture and water table or water availability as well. So that's the field study. The modeling study that we will be doing will be on a slightly smaller scale. So this will be on the column level scale. So we've gone from watershed level scale in the case study to kind of a subgrid scale in the field study. And now we're going even smaller, more controlled here using the modeling study, where we'll be running point-based simulations to piece apart the physical processes behind frost formation and really its relationship between hydrologic partitioning and dividing that snowmelt into water available flows. So that our kind of last big idea here is the effect that soil frost has on this partitioning metric. So we know pretty well that soil frost affects the infiltration of water. So more soil frost fills up the pore space and limits the amount of water that can kind of percolate into the soil column. Although, to be honest, even this has been shown to have some discrepancies in recent research. So a lot of models right now just assume that since it affects infiltration, if there is soil frost present, we're just going to assume there's no infiltration and all of it becomes surface runoff, which is kind of a bold assumption and isn't necessarily true in a lot of cases. So you can imagine that might be true at one point, but if you have an uneven frost layer, then there will be some spots where infiltration is happening versus other spots where it isn't. But there also can be throughout the season different times at which infiltration can be occurring and infiltration cannot be occurring. So this ends up being kind of what we would call soil frost's effects on hydrologic partitioning. And so this is the division of our precipitation and our snowpack melt into different hydrological flows, such as infiltration, surface runoff, subsurface runoff, and ET are kind of the four main ones that we consider. So this diagram on the left shows how frost and snow are kind of affecting those different flows. And it's extremely detailed, so I'm not going to walk you through this one, but I'm going to walk you through the slightly simpler version that we have developed. And so I will walk you through this in terms of the kind of partitioning metrics that we would be considering. So you might remember from your Hydro 101 class, our kind of standard water balance partition. So where we're dividing available precipitation into runoff and ET. And if we divide across by precipitation, we end up with some kind of runoff fraction, sometimes referred to as blue water, and an evaporative fraction, sometimes referred to as green water. So we end up with kind of a fraction of that precipitation that is going to each of these sources. So in this scenario, we're making it a little bit more complicated, but we apply that same thinking to our soil column. So here we have first a surface partition, where our water available from the snowpack is being divided into our surface runoff and our infiltration. So we end up with a surface runoff fraction and an infiltration fraction. And then we have, once we kind of get into our subsurface control volume, we have that infiltration that came from the surface partition, and then we have that additional soil moisture from the frost layer melting out. And so that quantity then is carried into our second partition, which happens in the subsurface, where frost is affecting the division of that frost available soil moisture and infiltration available soil moisture into our subsurface runoff, which you could then further divide into lateral flow and recharge and evapotranspiration. And so here we end up with two more metrics, which are subsurface fraction and our ET fraction. And so these are the four metrics that we're really going to be looking at in our modeling experiment, where we will be taking this soil column and we will be running a sensitivity analysis to winter temperature and snowfall inputs or snowfall fraction. So that's the proportion of precipitation falling in the form of snow. And so in this analysis, we'll vary winter temperatures according to future climate scenarios, and we'll be varying snowfall fraction plus or minus kind of 0.3 from where we are now. So increasing and decreasing soil fraction. And generally what we'll anticipate is that as we increase winter temperatures, we'll see higher amounts of ET, mostly due to that evaporative component and recharge. And then as we increase snowfall, we expect that our total runoff will increase in the form of both components. And we'll also co-vary these. So we will also run some scenarios where we'll increase winter temperatures and decrease snowfall fraction and vice versa. And this is a little bit tricky because those aren't necessarily independent factors. As we have colder winter temperatures, we're more likely to see snow. So we get a little bit iffy there. But what we expect to see will depend on the timing of snow melt and snow and frost melt and that timing of transpiration initiation. So I've said a lot about what we will be doing, and I do want to leave you with some results. But I will say that these are not my results actually. So these came out of a PhD thesis done by Harsh Anurag, who was a student of Crystal Nings, who's a WRS affiliated faculty. And Harsh graduated last year, and this made up the last chapter of his thesis, and unfortunately never got published because there's some really cool stuff going on here. And essentially what he did was the first part of this sensitivity analysis. So he ran our land surface model here for these snowfall cases. So he was just looking at how the changes in snowfall inputs vary our runoff and our ET relative fractions here. And he did this for two sites here in Minnesota, A southern site down here, which was mostly prairie grassland, and then a northern site up here, which was more boreal forest. Neither of these were peatlands. So we can kind of carry some of this interpretation over, but we will be redoing it for our peatland ecosystems. And so generally what we see is that you can see here for both of our sites, as we decrease our snowfall amount, our snowfall inputs over the winter, we see less and less runoff. And this is, I will note, this is runoff over precipitation. So you might you might initially think, oh, less snowfall, less runoff, that makes sense. However, when we're also saying there's less runoff when we normalize over that precipitation amount. So what this is saying is that as we are decreasing the amount of snowfall inputs, where we wouldn't normally expect this to then lead to increased soil frost and decreased infiltration. There's a lot of logic happening here. So decreased snow, increased soil frost would then lead to decreased infiltration, which we would assume would lead to more runoff. So there's a little orange flag here being like, okay, we should look into this a little bit further. And it turns out that if we look at the ET fraction, we have a similar little orange flag. We should look at this further, because as we have lower and lower amounts of snowfall, we actually, and we would again expect there to be less and less infiltration, we are seeing that ET, so the amount of water being taken up by our grasses or our trees, is increasing. So another little orange flag. So he dug a little bit deeper into this. And if we look kind of on the annual scale here, so on the top here, we have air temperature and snow inputs. And then we have our soil frost depth, our runoff, and our infiltration. And so in these dark lines, these are the cases with higher amounts of snowfall, and the light lines are cases with lower amounts of snowfall. You can immediately see that in those cases where there's less snowfall, we have a much less stable frost layer. So the frost layer during that spring period, instead of being consistently on the decline, is oscillating back and forth between periods of it disappearing and then reforming. And what this does is it allows in kind of small pulses of infiltration throughout the entire spring, instead of just infiltration at the end once the entire soil frost layer has disappeared. So in these scenarios, when we have less and less snowfall inputs, we are seeing less stable frost layers and more infiltration over the course of the spring season, which means that there is more water available for plant uptake. And so he then was able to take this one step further. And if we take that ET and that soil moisture over the course of the year, and we look at those lowest snowfall cases, we see that at both sites, we have much higher soil evaporation, higher vegetation transpiration, and higher vegetation evaporation. So in those scenarios in the future, when we expect to see less snowfall, we end up seeing a lot more ET because of those intermittent infiltration events. So we'll be continuing this research, adding in that temperature component as well, and repeating some of this experiment, but it does really shed some light on kind of what we can expect to happen over the next few years, the next several decades, in terms of general water availability within wetlands and those kind of plant growth opportunities. So I've talked about a lot. I'm going to do a real quick summary about, so the things that we generally know are that peatland methane emissions are water table dependent. So we are expecting that shifting water availability from winter to spring may cause increases in methane emissions. 2, we know that the water table elevation at Marcel is steadily decreasing. And 3, that there's this continuity in the wetland watersheds between the snowpack, the water table, and the stream flow. But that connectivity is controlled by the presence of soil frost. So what we are going forwards, what we are hoping to then find out further, is how environmental factors are affecting this frost formation, and by consequence, this connectivity, how fall antecedent soil moisture effects are affecting this frost formation, and also by consequence, spring water availability. And then the different ways that the different mechanisms behind how soil frost is affecting this hydrologic partitioning of snowmelt into stream flow. and then what we can expect from this partition under different future climate scenarios. So that is all I have. I want to say a big thanks to my advisor Shui for helping me think through a lot of this research, and to a big thanks also to Steve, who's the guy in orange there, who's the head hydrologist at Marcel, for helping Shui and I think through a lot of this research, and to all of my committee members and our funding sources below.
Steve Sebastian.
Yes.
Yeah.
So with that, I will take questions if there are any.
Might look online too.
I will look online. I'll turn the volume all the way up. Diana has a raised hand. Go ahead, Diana.
Hi, Mariel. Thanks for all this. Have you guys at all thought through or have thoughts on addressing the different nature of the frost? If we're getting a concrete frost or a granular frost? No, no tablet. Or a 9-year-old. Sorry. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And we have actually. So that's, yes. So the question is whether we've thought at all about the nature of the different kinds of frost formation. And that comes into play actually with potentially why we think we're seeing such a big influence of soil frost in the wetlands. And partially that is because of exactly what you mentioned, Diana, is that we think it is a concrete frost layer forming. So there are a couple different ways that frost can form. The most common in kind of mineral soils is that it forms as like a fraction of the pore space. So that's where you could allow still like a little bit of infiltration through. The other way, and the way that we think is occurring in the wetlands, because there's such a high water content in the upper column, is that it forms essentially a concrete block of ice across the top layer. And this really does not allow any infiltration through. And so that might be why we're seeing such a big influence, is because of that method of frost formation. Yeah. Yes, and there might be a bigger difference with less flow. Excellent question. Thanks. Thank you. Yeah.
I have 2 questions following up on that, just because I don't know a ton about frost. I guess since you already have these sites, this is kind of set for you, but is there any difference in like that frost structure depending on like the level of peat humidification? Like if you have a saprate peat versus a fibric peat, has anybody looked into that?
I highly doubt anyone has looked into that. We haven't really thought about it because all of our sites are done at Marcel. But if you had different locations where there were different peat formations, I would expect that you might see a difference. But I'm not entirely sure.
My second question is unrelated. Is there any potential for doing snow removal treatments in your field study, or is your model better capturing like those changes than any like field implementation would? Because separate from this, I know people do snow removal sometimes for frost studies, but I'm not sure if that's like super relevant to this one.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why we're pairing this with the model study, is that we can do those mathematically, so we don't have to go out and do those removal studies. It is a little, because Marcel's is still a little ways away, we wouldn't be able to go up and do those throughout the entire winter. And we do want to try to leave the watershed as a whole kind of as undisturbed as possible. So that is kind of something we're hoping to target more with the modeling study. For sure. Are there any more online questions?
To ask a question.
There is not. Go
Okay,
for it.
so about the measurement of the frost depth, this you're using soil moisture and temperature. So I'm wondering how the soil moisture probe, is it a resistance probe, or how does it measure at just discrete points, or do you?
Yes. Yeah. So they sample soil moisture so they're 45 centimeter probes, and they sample soil moisture at 3 of those increments. So at 15, 30, and 45 centimeter depths, and then temperature at 5 increments along as well. So we'll be able to kind of match up those two values.
Well, it's nice to be able to get the
Yes.
continuous reading.
Yes.
I was gonna suggest, I mean, I was gonna say, we used to use frost tubes.
Mhm.
I don't know if you looked at those. Of course, that requires you to go out and,
Yes.
pull them up and read them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, and my second question, I mean, you were showing the graph of the drop in the water table.
Mhm.
Peatland fall or after frost forms.
Mhm. Mhm.
So what is the drop? I mean, it's not evaporation.
Yeah, that's kind of one of my big qualms with what we've been able to do so far is we still haven't been able to figure out exactly what is driving that drop. But we've been able to kind of spin it off into it's probably soil frost in some way, shape, or form. But I wish we could figure out exactly what it
Well,
was that
could
was
I
causing
suggest
that.
something?
but-
This just happened to be by circumstance.
Mhm.
Sandy Berry, who used to run this.
Yep.
He and others have done studies on
ET.
deep groundwater.
Oh, okay.
That is going down the regional groundwater flow. Or peatlands.
Oh,
And
interesting.
They've
Okay.
estimated the percolation rates below. So if you have something preventing down.
Yeah.
Surface, then you're probably just draining the reservoir.
Mhm.
underneath. So
Okay.
you might look at that. I don't remember what the numbers were
Yeah.
offhand, but they were not insignificant.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I looked at a bunch of his research, particularly related to ET at Marcel, because that was our first big thought was that it's just forest growth and increasing ET. But we didn't have quite the data we needed to actually build a reasonable model for ET. So we just had to go based on really winter temperature measurements, which weren't great.
I mean,
But
that's
yeah,
another.
that's good to
avenue by
know.
which
Yeah.
Water can flow out.
Yeah,
from the
yeah.
Surface, but it can also flow out of the bottom.
Yeah, that is good because we've been trying to decide how much of an impact to put on kind of recharge in the wetland systems because they have that kind of perched water table. We've been debating whether or not to actually include it too much in that partition, but that's good to know that it might end up being a bigger part of this story than we thought.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, if there are no more questions.
Yeah, if there are no other questions, then let's thank Mariel for an excellent presentation.
I will say, if you want to learn a little bit more about peatlands, there are these New York Times articles that I've referenced that have been they've circled a bunch of them about, and they're all really cool and really they've got these great illustrations. And so if you're interested in learning a little bit more about peatlands and their functions, I would definitely direct you to these. They're a lot of fun. But yeah, thank you all for coming.
So you can stop the recording.
Find my way back over here. All right. Have a lovely weekend, everyone. Okay, well, Bailey messaged me and then she left. So oops. It's fine. I'll just catch her at the next event. Okay.